Polishable overlays are popular because it gives a contractor the ability to offer polished concrete on slabs that would otherwise not reach a certain aesthetic of new concrete or something that can't match exactly the client's expectations for what they think polished concrete should look like. Once a floor has been ground and a lot of the rock is exposed, as was the case with this floor that had previously been coated or previously been clad by carpet or VCT or any other superficial coating, once that's removed, the floor has to be prepped and cleaned in order to be polished. The overlay gives the option of cleaning the floor, prepping it, and then coating it so it looks brand new, like brand new concrete. So the nice part about the overlays is that a superficial coating, 3/8 to a 1/2 inch thick, can cover over the slab, and as far as anybody is concerned by appearance, it looks like polished concrete. The installation is pretty basic as far as any coating. The floor is shot blasted, epoxy primed, and then sand broadcast to create a profile on the floor that's clean and also allow the overlay as it hardens to actually grip it like Velcro. It actually grabs itself to the floor. The bond will be perfectly sound, and that would of course eliminate the potential for cracking or delamination. The placement procedure is going to vary based on manufacturer specifications. This particular one was mixed 4 bags at a time, dumped to the floor, and then gauged out with a gauge rake at a 1/2 inch. And then for the purpose of testing, we did a spike roller on one side and a smoother on the other to see what the difference would be in the final appearance. The floor was allowed to cure for 20 hours, and then we brought the grinder in to start grinding away at it with a 40 grit. Now this particular floor, which we learned as we ground, is actually meant to be installed at a 1/2 inch, but finished off at about 3/8 of an inch. So that means a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch is going to be removed. It's something that's special for this particular product, but nonetheless, in order for it to get the reveal of the aggregate that's inside the mix to be exposed, that's what was required. As we started to cut on it with 40 grits, we found out that they just weren't aggressive enough to break through that cap and remove that much material. So the choice was made to drop to a 16 grit, which is a much more aggressive diamond, and the idea with that, of course, is to remove that bulk material much quicker than a 40 grit could. Anytime that we'd use an aggressive diamond like that, we'd of course be concerned that we're damaging the surface to the extent that the next diamond would have to work that much harder to clean it up. There really wasn't much choice. Labor is going to be much higher if we go with, let's say, a 40 grit that's less aggressive or less damaging to the surface, but obviously going to take much longer to remove that much stock. As we started grinding with the 16 grits, we found that during installation, there were areas where the material from one pour to the next had began to dry, and when the next pour was brought in and dumped next to it, we didn't get it blended in very well with the material that was poured previously, in our case about 5 minutes before, so we had problems with seams or pour lines. The pour lines wouldn't be a problem if this floor was going to be covered in carpet or VCT, but because this is a polished slab, whatever the floor has as far as color variation, it's only going to get worse and more noticeable as the floor becomes polished. Also, because we did the testing of a smoother to smooth the material out, and then also a spike roller to see how that would affect the finish, we found that from the spike roller, there were actually marks in the surface that gave it almost like a carpet look or like a loop look. What we think happened is the spikes pushed the aggregate down and then of course allow the matrix or the material itself to come up. So because of the weight of the aggregate, once it's pushed down, it doesn't necessarily want to come back up to the surface. So we end up with a patterning on the surface of the floor that would probably not be acceptable because again, when it's polished, it's only going to become more noticeable. On the smoother side, we didn't have any marks from the roller because we didn't use it, but we did have start and stop marks where the smoother was set into the floor. When it was set in, if it happened to sink in a little bit, the problem there is that it pushes some of that aggregate down and then allows the matrix to rise up. The different colors, of course, is the variation in the materials themselves. During placement, anything that's not uniform in the way that it's put down on the floor, as it hardens and then it's ground, it's going to show itself. Being that the floor is going to be exposed when it's polished and any color variations will be seen, the objective then became to grind through that surface until we had uniform color. This took a lot of grinding, 6 steps of grinding with the 16 grits, crossing it up each time to remove the discoloration. At the same time, being very cautious not to focus on any of the colored areas because the more we dig in one spot, the more we're going to affect the flatness of the floor. The amount of material taken from the floor was over 1/8 of an inch. The only way that can be done is to methodically run the grinder over the floor, very similar to the terrazzo industry, going over the entire surface until the floor becomes uniform. Once this is done and the floor is uniform in color, then it's just a matter of polishing the overlay. So from the 16 grit, then the 40 grit was done to take out the scratches from the 16 and begin the official system that is made to polish the overlay. This is done exactly the same way as the 16. The only difference is it's run one time over the floor. After the 40 grit, we went to the 80 grit, or the number 2, and the 80 grit was run the same way as the 40 grit. Again, one time over the whole floor to simply remove the scratches from the 40. Now at this point, we're so high in the metal steps that flatness of the floor is not going to be affected. So if we haven't done a good job of grinding the floor methodically with the 16s to flatten it, the 80 grit is simply going to take out the scratches from the 40. After that, the 150 grit, or the number 3. 150 grit, same thing as the 80 to the 40. All we're trying to do is take out the scratches from the 80. Not going to affect the flatness issues whatsoever. The diamond is so high a grit, it's not going to have any influence over the flatness of the floor. Once this is done, move into the number 4, which is a copper bonded tool. It's a 100, 200 grit resin pad, and that's currently where we're at. As this pad is run over the floor, it's very easy to see the dramatic change from what appears to be scratched and chalky to now looking refined, or almost having a satin patina. And that's just the middle of the polishing process. The vast amount of work that takes place is everything up to this point, but everything up to this point is essential to each part of the process being as efficient as possible. If any part of the process, especially the preparation, especially the primer, which is the most important, that's going to fuse this coating to the slab, if that's not done correctly, delamination issues and cracking are very likely. If the placement is not done correctly and it causes any kind of aesthetic issues that appear later, the grinder is going to have to fix that. And the only way to do that is to go over it multiple times. So the labor, of course, can start to get expensive. The only alternative to fixing it is to literally rip it out and try again, or to cover it over again with the same material, which presents different issues and obviously a lot more cost. The big takeaway from this is to make sure that during placement, the work crew understands exactly the proper sequence of work. There's enough equipment. We only had one mixer. We definitely should have had 2. Even from the standpoint of the labor that had to stand around waiting for the next batch of material to be mixed out of one mixer only, there's a loss of labor right there, which would easily justify the investment in a second mixer so that the flow of material was continuous. The biggest takeaway again is understanding the product, knowing proper placement, and then quite honestly practicing. I would strongly recommend training by manufacturers or manufacturer representatives to make sure that it's very well understood exactly how this floor is supposed to be installed, because fixing this after the fact is a much more expensive proposition than doing it right the first time. If you have any questions or comments, we always appreciate receiving those. If you like what you watch, please drop us a like below. Thank you again.